Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for the first Climate and Society event. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society, and we are absolutely thrilled to have Amelia Moore from the University of Rhode Island and Alex Halliday from Columbia University to help kick off this new lecture series in Climate and Society. Before I give the floor to our speaker and chair, I want to just briefly introduce the Center for Science and Society and share the inspiration for our Climate and Society series. I founded the Center for Science and Society in 2014 to bring together researchers, scholars, and practitioners in the natural and social sciences, the humanities, law, medicine, and the arts to engage in interdisciplinary teaching, research, and outreach. The center works to eliminate traditional disciplinary silos, create new hubs of cross-disciplinary teaching and research, and enhance public understanding of science in society. We explore everything from privacy issues of big data to how trauma impacts the brain to developing sustainable food systems. We do this all through an array of activities that spans research, teaching, public outreach, and many, many events. Columbia University's latest addition to its roster of schools is the Columbia Climate School. With Alex Halliday as its founding dean, the school will strive to form a hub of interdisciplinary research, education, and practice focused around climate and its related challenges. Complex phenomena such as the climate crisis are so multidimensional that they need more than just a scientific or technological lens. Instead, the combined expertise of researchers in social and human behavior, culture, politics and policy, economics, communication, and many, many other areas must be brought to bear. The Climate and Society series will incorporate these principles and showcase the work of leading scholars at Columbia and elsewhere on climate, environment, sustainability, and their social and cultural dimensions. In addition to the Columbia Climate School, I want to thank our other partners, including the Earth Institute, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the Climate and Society MA program at Columbia, and the Columbia University Dean of Humanities, Sarah Cole. They have all been instrumental in starting this pop-up series in Climate and Society in very short order, along with center staff, Melinda Miller and Joseph Sulik. And I want to say that I'm deeply grateful to all of you for your help and input on this series. We look forward to continuing it in the fall. Before we turn to our event today, I just want to let you know that Dr. Moore is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and we welcome your questions in the chat feature that's at the bottom of the screen. As you probably all know, you can enter your questions at any time as they occur to you into chat, or you can raise your hand, your virtual hand. That would make it easier at the end, and to be called upon to ask your question live. If you'd like to enter your question into the chat and say that you'd like to ask it live, that's great. That would be really useful. I also just wanted to mention that our next event is on May 18th, and I can't seem to get to that slide, I'm sorry to say, is on May 18th at 5:30 p.m. again on Zoom. It's with Rosalind Lapierre from the University of Montana and Robin Bell from Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Alex Halliday, who will chair today's event. I just want to say we are immensely privileged and honored to have Dr. Halliday, who is director of Columbia University's Earth Institute and the founding co-director of the Columbia Climate School, chairing today's lecture. Dr. Halliday joined Columbia recently in 2018 after spending more than a decade at Oxford University, where he was Dean of Science and Engineering. His over 400 published research papers have been pioneering in developing mass spectrometry to measure small isotopic variations in everything from meteorites to seawater to living organisms, helping to shed light on the birth and early developments of the solar system, the interior workings of the Earth, and the processes that affect Earth's surface environment. His scientific achievements have been recognized through numerous awards, including the Murchison Medal of the Geological Society, the Bowen Award and Hess Medal of the American Geophysical Union, the Urey Medal of the European Association of Geochemistry, the Augsburg Medal of the Institute of Measurement and Control, as well as a knighthood for services to science and innovation, which was a surprise to me. I didn't know we were supposed to be calling you Sir Alex. He's also a fellow of the UK's Royal Society and an international member of the US National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Halliday has helped to lead a variety of distinguished scientific societies and advisory panels. He's former vice president of the Royal Society and former president of the Geochemical Society. He's also a professor in Columbia's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and he divides his time between the Morningside campus and his isotope geochemistry lab at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And I can attest that his main focus is completely immersed in establishing the new Columbia Climate School at this point. And we are very fortunate to have him in that role and also today as chair. And I just want to add that from my perspective as a member of the design committee for the climate school, that Alex has just been exemplary in leading the design process. And it's really typical of his welcoming and inclusive style that he agreed immediately and enthusiastically to partner with the center on the series and to participate as inaugural chair. So thank you, Alex. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you and to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Amelia Moore.
Well, thank you very much. I've got a pink shirt, but I think the pink in my skin is mainly my embarrassment by your introduction. I feel really, really flattered. But I just want to say that it's brilliant to be at Columbia. Columbia is such a fun university. Academia should be fun. I mean, it's hard work, so you might as well at least have fun with it. And I do think part of the fun of Columbia is being able to work with so many brilliant, exciting scholars across the university on such interesting topics. And actually, you know, forgetting the traditional subjects, let's focus on some of the new things we're going to need to think about for the future. So in that context, it's brilliant that we've got Dr. Amelia Moore with us today. Amelia is a social cultural anthropologist studying environmental politics, green tourism design and branding, and the social worlds of field ecology. And if that doesn't sound cross-disciplinary to you, I think we've got a bit of catching up to do. So she is an associate professor of marine affairs in the College of Environment and Life Sciences at the University of Rhode Island. Amelia earned her BA in environmental biology from Columbia University and her PhD in social cultural anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. Amelia approaches her research areas through the adaptive lens of feminist studies of science and Black ecologies, building bridges between critical theories of social difference, anthropology, post and decolonial studies, political ecology, and the social ecological sciences. She currently is involved in projects in the coastal state of Rhode Island, but also in Indonesia and the Bahamas, which is her long-term research home. So I'm really excited about hearing what she's got to say and learning a load from this area. It's going to be brilliant to hear. So she's going to talk to us today about intersectional ecologies, moving beyond interdisciplinarity and diversity on the path towards climate justice. Over to you, Amelia.
All right, are we up and running? Fantastic. So thank you, Pam and Alex, for inviting me to speak today. I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to continue to think through some recent work with a new audience. I've given version of this talk already this year to geographers at the London School of Economics and to the Gender and Women's Studies Department at URI. And so some of you might have heard some of this before, but each session is a chance to deepen the relevance of this work and the ideas presented and to engage the material in slightly different ways. So there will be some changes and some tweaks in this version. But before I dive in, I want to say that the phrase intersectional ecologies is the title of a forthcoming article for the annual review of anthropology that I've written with Sarah Vaughan and Bridget Gorashi, And that article develops this concept of intersectional ecologies further. So if you're interested in that, please look out for it. And I also want to point that out because collaboration is a theme that runs through this talk and that runs through my work. So I'll begin by giving you some insight into my own positionality and relevant life history, which are central to my overall arguments. And then I'll describe 3 projects that have shaped the way that I think and work as an anthropologist of the Anthropocene. As a student researcher in the Bahamas, I struggled with the limits of conventional interdisciplinary conservation science. Working with a coral restoration project in Indonesia made me painfully aware of the pitfalls of univocal witnessing. And helping to rematerialize the island of Manassas in the state of Rhode Island revealed to me the narrow categories of inclusion and exclusion that constrain any real possibility of a just energy transition. So I'll explain how these projects led me to become a small part of a network of scholars who show that we gain practical, analytic, and ethical insight from the intersections of theory, history, geography, social categories of difference, ways of knowing, lived experiences, and forms of being. I'll conclude by sharing how I now see these insights as essential for our evolving understandings of climate change and climate justice. I earned tenure at my institution last summer, and some of you listening may recognize the feelings I'm currently experiencing. I'm in a period of stock taking. I'm reflecting on where I've been and what I want to do with the opportunities that I've been given. This feeling seems to mirror the current American moment in which we've been through an acute intensification of racial trauma in the midst of a global pandemic. And of course, we also had an election last year, followed by an attempted insurrection this year. And now we're all taking stock and reflecting on how on earth we got here and what on earth we can do next. So this talk is an attempt to harness this collective reflective moment to see if my own reflections on my own work might resonate with you wherever you are in your corner of the world. My goal is to connect events in my own life to key projects in my career, to key intellectual interlocutors who have emerged to guide me, and to critical conversations about climate change. I'm an environmental anthropologist and social scientist, but I hope I can model how we might all reflect on climate and other forms of global change as members of a scholarly community oriented around intersectional ethics. So you have to know a bit about who I am to understand where I am now in the physical, intellectual, and ethical sense. Today, I am an American woman of color, say that in quotes, living in New England, but I grew up mixed, also in quotes, in the Pacific Northwest. Before I was born, my parents escaped to Seattle from the various segregated communities of their youth. My mother was descended from, or is descended from enslaved people, at least one of whom ran away to freedom from the South to the state of Rhode Island generations ago. But she was born back in the South and raised in the African-American community surrounding Tuskegee University, where her parents were both English professors. My father split his childhood time between his father's house in Missouri and his mother's house in Florida, on the white side of Jim Crow apartheid in both states. My younger brother and I grew up in a predominantly white, middle-class community, looking like we do, bathed in the privilege of ambiguity, only dimly aware of this heritage and the fact that we are a part of a family of African-American educators and activists who had long struggled to carve a path for others to follow and who depended on so many others to set them on that path. My mother patiently held me to educational standards I did not always fully appreciate because she wanted me to know what I shared with her, her cousins, her aunt, my grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother. And that is what it means to be an accomplished and driven Black woman. So my particular story matters because it provides me with one perspective from which to attempt, along with many accomplices, to revise the dominant conversation about the nature of crisis and responsibility. Growing up in Seattle was a lesson in American white supremacist myopia. But of course, I didn't realize I was being schooled. As a child, I had no idea that the house my family lived in was part of a neighborhood that had expressly excluded Black people from home ownership at the time of its founding in the 1940s. I had no idea that there was a multi-generational community of African Americans that had long called the Central District of the city their home, struggling to survive through the gentrification of successive tech booms. And while there were and are still surface level celebrations of what we called Native American culture all over the region, including the name of the city of Seattle itself, I had no idea that successive waves of white settlers looking for timber and other resources had pushed the original indigenous inhabitants of the Northwest Coast onto reservations, while deforesting, overfishing, polluting, damming, dredging, filling in and paving over the land to create the urban infrastructure that I very much took for granted. For example, the Duwamish people lived in and do live in what is now known as Metro Seattle, and they are not recognized by our federal government even now. As an adolescent, I worried about fitting in, but I didn't know enough to worry about what I was trying to fit into. Today, I'm reflecting on what it means to be the recipient of these interwoven complex legacies in the midst of multiple compounding and inextricably entangled crises. There's the crisis that brings us together today, climate change. There's the current pandemic and its future mutations. There's the ongoing crisis of white supremacy and extractive colonialism, which still thrives in all our circles. There's the crisis of the underrepresentation of minoritized groups, especially pertaining to, but not limited to, Black and Indigenous folks within and well beyond the American Academy. There's the crisis of unprecedented economic polarization and the ever widening wealth gap between the incredibly rich and the rest of us. Am I, and are we, capable of understanding all of this as one holistic and perpetuating conjunction? That's what it means to be an anthropologist of the Anthropocene, otherwise known as the racial capitalocene or plantationocene. There are a number of terms like this that more or less accurately describe the current moment. But if the Anthropocene is the term that the scientific community is using, even if they're arguing about it, with all its built-in assumptions about the primacy of an undifferentiated, apolitical, and ahistorical humanity, then those assumptions, and of course their limits, are exactly what we should study. Today, I want to think about the limits of interdisciplinarity, as commonly practiced, and the limits of diversity as commonly understood. The multiple compounding crises of the Anthropocene exhaust the utility of these notions. So by the end of this talk, I hope that it'll be clear that I do not promote the term Anthropocene, and that I'm not against terms like interdisciplinary or diversity, but I do examine all of these things as social ideas. And I also examine my own role in perpetuating these ideas or their alternatives, and that all matters. So what do these compounding crises look like on the ground? So I want to take you to 3 different locations that all happen to be islands, but this is no Darwinian voyage of discovery. Think of this as more like being visited by 3 spirits. My recent book describes what I call the Anthropocene Islands of the Bahamas. I spent much of my 20s, my years as a graduate student, chasing after Euro-American conservation scientists, trying to catch them in the act of making biocomplexity theory, also known as interdisciplinary coupled natural and human systems theory, visible and tangible through a number of linked projects across several islands and keys in the Bahamian archipelago. I participated in social data collection and tiny fishing settlements. I visited field research stations, and I watched science divers plunge into aquatic caves to look for planetary history and fall backwards over the sides of boats to measure the spread of invasive species in coral reef ecosystems. At that time in the mid-2000s, I was deep into science and technology studies, and I believed that the post-colonial racial politics of the Anglophone Caribbean was in the midst of being somehow transcended by new debates about ecology, anthropogenic climate change, and human environmental relationality. My head was filled with Latour, Foucault, Haraway, and their many disciples. But as time went on, I came to realize that the international tourism industry had far more power in the Bahamas than science and scientists, and that the Bahamian tourism brand remained steeped in violently racist manifestations of leisure, labor, and space. I could see how the interdisciplinary environmental science I was studying was framed and constrained by this pervasive and deeply material supremacy. The Anthropocene sciences cannot transcend the supremacist landscape. In fact, Anthropocene science helps reproduce it. In the Bahamas, environmental science and tourism are bedfellows. The capitalization, racialization, and institutionalization of emergent sustainable paradise travel branding aligns with scientific research about small islands as the frontline canaries in the coal mine of global change. And together, the science and tourism industries are redesigning an archipelago in the image of a fragile planet as a means of diversifying the regional tourism portfolio. From sun, sand, sea, and sex on the beach, to marine protected areas, coral restoration, voluntourism, invasive lionfish ceviche, of which this is an image, and vulnerable island ecologies, the industry adapts with no trace of irony. These forms of sustainable tourism certainly do sustain the Bahamas as a kind of neo-colonial laboratory for Euro-American Anthropocene research and tourism brand development. In this framing, the racialized Black local becomes synonymous with ignorance and the requisite capacity building and outreach. But foreign white researchers and their students, along with elite travelers who seek out eco experiences, also known as sustainable luxury, become global Anthropocene subjects. They are simultaneously leaders in planetary conservation and consumers of green destination branding. Prior to Hurricane Dorian, which slammed the Bahamas in September of 2019, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which slammed all of us in March of 2020, the Bahamas welcomed a record-setting 7 million annual visitors by jumbo jet, cruise ship, charter boat, and private plane. Think of the carbon emissions, waste, and consumption, all of which were sustained until our compounding crises forced the country into lockdown. At this moment, the Bahamas is experiencing the storm violence of climate change, which led to dozens dead, over 1,000 missing, the globalized violence of the pandemic, over 100 people dead, thousands of cases, and thousands of lost jobs, and the everyday violence of supremacy, which has kept the country dependent on foreign investment and tourism and reliant on foreign scientific expertise. One of my realizations from this Bahamian work has been that interdisciplinarity, at least the kind practiced by coupled natural and human systems research, cannot approach or even really acknowledge this level of generational violence. Combining socioeconomic surveys of fishing communities with marine protected area modeling or ocean habitat mapping can only provide a mere snapshot of the entangled human and non-human lives that co-emerge through contingent processes that are simultaneously biological, geological, cultural, economic, and political. The human dimensions of most interdisciplinary projects have therefore been profoundly stunted in practice, and they often perpetuate the assumptions of the status quo. They also fail to recognize how science itself is a historically and culturally mediated human dimension that can frame the narrative in ways that perpetuate supremacy. My second example takes us to another island region on the other side of the planet, and to a project which is still ongoing, although currently paused by COVID. In my first year at the University of Rhode Island, my dean asked faculty in my college if we'd be interested in working with a large multinational company to help them monitor their own coral restoration project already begun in the Spermande Archipelago in Indonesia. I had seen some examples of coral restoration at work in the Bahamas, mostly at the hands of small non-governmental organizations. So I wondered how a private company was going about designing a large-scale restoration project. I was also new and eager to please, so I somewhat naively agreed to participate, along with a few other colleagues and our students. I don't have the time to get into all the details with you here, but for me, this example hinges on the rhetorics of representation. To use the language of one of my mentors, Paige West, and I'll come back to her later. These rhetorics surround the crisis of planetary coral reef death due to warming and acidifying seas, blast fishing and pollution, and coral restoration as an increasingly popular response to this crisis. In other words, how we witness coral life and death and how we talk about it matters. So here's an example. The company designing the Coral Restoration Project posted a video to their website last year. I can't show you the video to protect the island community and their anonymity, but the video opens with an underwater coral rubblescape, much like this. Somber piano music plays over the empty seabed. Text at the bottom of the screen reads, 90% of coral reefs are predicted to be lost by 2040. It's not clear exactly where this filming is occurring, but the website says that these are scenes from the company's coral restoration site. The images switch to above water scenes from the rural island that most viewers might identify as being somewhere in the global south. I know it is a small island in the Spermunde, but the video does not mention that. There are images of colorful wooden homes and running brown children accompanied by livelier music. The screen reads, our business and the many communities we source raw materials from depend on the ocean and its reefs, so we've stepped up to help. The scene then shifts to show a small group of men and women making the simple metal structures the company has designed to use in their restoration process. A group of non-European looking people are shown painting the hexagonal steel structures with resin and then dipping them in piles of coral sand to create the finished coating. The screen reads, they're built by local communities using locally sourced products. We then see the freshly assembled reef structures being loaded onto motorboats and transported to a shallow area where smiling, nameless male community members stand in the sea and tie coral fragments to the structures resting on floating pontoon tables. This is followed by unidentifiable wetsuited snorkelers placing the stars on the seafloor, followed by equally unidentifiable divers in scuba gear attaching them to the seabed in a grid pattern. Suddenly, the screen shifts to show what our eyes might consider to be a perfect reef, filled with pointy staghorn and table corals of different colors and textures, swarming with schools of small fish. The transition comes with a rush of exultant music. The screen reads, within 20 months, the restored reef structures provide 60% coral cover, rich in coral abundance and diversity. An unidentifiable diver hovers over the thriving reef, spreading their arms wide as if to say, look at all the abundance. The screen reads, after 3 years, the impact of the reef structures is even more inspiring. The video shows close-up images of different corals and their multifaceted polyps. The screen reads, supporting life both within and beyond the reefs. We then see images of a sea turtle, a large grouper, and a reef shark. The last words on the screen are, we know our business cannot thrive unless the planet and the people we rely on also thrive. We see a cuttlefish and then another sea turtle. Finally, the screen flashes the company logo and fades to black. This video can currently be found on both the company's website and on YouTube. Working in this restoration project, we found ourselves plunged into a neo-colonial drama for the ages, also known as business as usual in the corporate social responsibility world. There's so much that can be said of even this one small example of the politics of witnessing coral restoration, but for now, I'll keep it brief. This video is designed for Euro-American investors and consumers, not for the rural fishing community of islanders whose reefs are in the process of being restored. It brands the company's restoration project as an aesthetically smooth transition from locally caused degradation to verdantly restored reef functioning via successful community-based engagement and innovative design. The prime mover is the benevolent, private, multinational company. But this video obscures far more than it could ever reveal. For starters, the video does not reveal the company's own role in the industrial scale extraction of fish and other marine and terrestrial resources in Indonesia, or its own role in global carbon emissions in the production and transport of its products. It does not reveal the ways in which the company's own expansive role in Indonesia mirrors that of the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century, in that it has become the de facto driver of governance in the small island. The video also neglects to reveal any of the complexity of the small island community the company purports to rely on, which has been grappling with the arrival of company representatives who have organized the restoration project with local government officials and devised the plan to compensate islanders for their labor in the deployment of the reef structures. The community also has to accommodate representatives from a regional Indonesian university who come to survey them about their involvement in the restoration project, along with dozens of Euro-American scientists and researchers who come to view and monitor the restored reef areas, myself included. Islanders have had to reckon with the expansion of re-territorialized protected area space in the waters surrounding their home, the disruption of inter-island relationships tied to reef fishing in the archipelago, and with concerns over the inequitable distribution of restoration jobs and benefits around the island. And of course, they also wonder about the future. What will happen to the reef and to their island's economy once the company finishes its project and exits the area? There is as yet no direct evidence that restored reefs will positively affect fish abundance in ways that can sustain a market or subsistence economy. And it's too early to know how well these reefs will stand up to storms, warming seas, various forms of human disturbance, and the long-term living conditions of the Spermonde. Our team's investigations find that most islanders do support the restoration project in some way. But after many hours of open-ended conversation with residents, the team has determined that this support has little to do with caring for coral and more to do with monetary compensation and the island's new affiliation with what are perceived to be powerful, wealthy, Western, white interests. The video does not explore this reality. Instead, it removes island people from their situated context to make them into Instagrammable brown stewards of decontextualized reef matter. The island, the coral, and the islanders in this unnamed part of Indonesia will now circulate online as long as the company wants them to. As a witnessing tool, the video may be more valuable to the reputation of the company and the expansion of their global restoration goals than the actual islanders and their actual reef. The video can have a life of its own, no matter what happens to these specific coral in the future. One immediate observation we can make here is that there's something wrong with the company's singular perspective and narrative about its own coral restoration practices. The people who are most affected by the project are nameless characters, playing the well-worn role of undifferentiated and racialized community members in need of saving from themselves. Coral, too, are homogenized in this narrativization, understood through the narrow lens of conservation biology to have social value only when they look like the verdant reefs popularized by marine dive tourism. Again, the generational long-term relationships between islanders and their reef ecologies are totally absent from the story, as are the complex regional histories and economies that connect these islands to the rest of the world in ways that have been profoundly violent and extractive. And again, more interdisciplinary research in and of itself is not necessarily going to tell a more accurate story here. It matters precisely which human dimensions we choose to focus on. My last example brings me back to my current home in the state of Rhode Island and to a project that remains active at this very moment. I didn't have the capacity to see manacees when I moved to take my position in 2015. I had never heard of the word or the island before, and I had never even heard of the conventional settler name for the place, which is Block Island. I am a sociocultural anthropologist, so you might think that learning to see manacees comes easier to me than to most, but at first I only saw the wind turbines in what is now known as the Block Island Wind Farm. I was fascinated by the introduction of this new infrastructure into the regional fishing and sailing seascape, and I wanted to know how the people and the businesses of the region were adapting or not to something as massively visible as America's first offshore wind farm. I joined a research team in 2016 to investigate this question for the federal government. My colleagues and our government funders knew a lot about energy transitions, infrastructure, and public assessment, but they knew nothing and therefore could teach me nothing about something as hidden as manacees. In retrospect, there were signals that manacees was all around me while I was doing fieldwork on Block Island, but I didn't know what I was seeing or hearing. Local residents would tell me about the struggle to build the wind farm and how disruptive the construction process had been for their daily lives. There were whole weeks when the process was shut down because the earth moving operation to bury the energy cables connecting the turbines to the onshore grid had encountered archaeological sites that required investigation. What was the wind farm construction unearthing? Most residents didn't know. As part of my research goal to understand the appeal of the island for regional tourism, I would often ride a bicycle all over the place on summer days, reveling in the smell of wildflowers and meadow grasses along the roadways. If I had time, I'd sometimes ride to one of the natural areas of the island and go for a little hike. More than 44% of the island is held in conservancy in perpetuity. It is said by the island's conservancy organization that this achievement provides recreational areas, preserves scenic views, protects crucial habitats for rare plants and animals, and protects the natural recharging the island's sole source aquifer, its only water supply. But the Conservancy said nothing about manatees. And there was the Island Museum, which told the stories of the dead white men whose names are embossed on Settlers Rock, whose tombstones are featured prominently in the island's main cemetery, and whose descendants still annually celebrate their arrival. Some rooms of the museum also displayed unearthed cultural materials and models representing the way people used to live on the island before European invaders and the founding families changed the place forever. I perused the contents of these rooms in my spare time. I was looking for examples of early forms of energy infrastructure on the island, but I could not see manatees staring back at me from the shelves. So although Block Island has a richly documented settler history and this museum that displays archaeological materials from the deep past, public memory has erased the contemporary presence of Black and Indigenous people on the island. This process of erasure has been so successful that nearly all public reference to Indigenous and African American life on the island is in the past tense. Popular lore claims that the last Manasean Indian to live on the island, Isaac Church, died in 1886. This is an image of the Indian cemetery on the island, what they call the Indian cemetery. And the only African American, only in quotes, to live there, Fred Benson, died in 1996. Both of these claims are apocryphal. The last Manasean Indian had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and there are records of African slaveholding and several different waves of Black migration to the island over many generations. But these erasures have enabled the solidification of settler narratives and the uncomplicated use of valuable island space for tourism and vacation home real estate. Essentially, for most Block Islanders and for the legal procedures of the state and federal government, there are no populations of Indigenous or African Americans on Block Island, and Manaseans no longer exist. Today, several of my colleagues and I are collaborating with the Black Indigenous Island family and many other partners on an ambitious project to remind New Englanders of the island's original name in the Narragansett Indigenous language, Manasees, and to explore the underappreciated history of the survival of the island's Indigenous and enslaved people. So this is an image of a graduate student, Adrian Cato, and the head of the Manasean Tribal Council, Marianne Matthews. Our goal is to collaboratively re-narrate the history of Block Island from the perspective of Indigenous and African Americans, beginning with the intermingled presidents of coastal Narragansett, Wampanoag, Niantic, and Pequot peoples before the arrival of the 16 founding white settler families in the 17th century, and proceeding all the way to this very moment. But at this point, you might be wondering what this has to do with climate change. Let me try and show you by bringing us back to the wind farm. New England offshore energy development is a legal process that perpetuates settler colonial hierarchies, even as it promotes alternative sources of energy. The recognition of Indigenous peoples in this process is complicated, to say the least. Although there is a legal prioritization of members of federally recognized tribes as certain kinds of stakeholders in offshore development planning, members from some non-federally recognized tribes have mixed access to these processes. For instance, members of the federally recognized Narragansett tribe participated alongside Nipmuc tribal members of Massachusetts, who are recognized by the state but not the federal government, in the Block Island wind farm planning process. But of course, no Manaseans were included in the project. Indeed, the term Manasean does not even appear in the best practices report that resulted from the collaboration between Native peoples and scientists involved in the Block Island wind farm. The inconsistent inclusion of people of Indigenous descent illustrates the historically complicated relationship between the extractive US government, settler society, and the Indigenous populations, and can help perpetuate the myth of Indigenous extinction in the region. Further, the governmental planning processes that legally mandate cultural heritage research in the siting of energy infrastructure may also perpetuate static visions of Indigenous cultures. Although scientists involved in the Block Island wind farm planning process noted the problematic nature of using terms like prehistoric to describe material culture identified during explorations of submerged sites, because prehistoric implies that history begins only with European occupation of the Americas, their substitution of the prefix paleo, as in paleo landscapes and paleocultural sites, as referring to old or ancient times without reference to any particular time period, continues to relegate Indigenous peoples' presence to the relatively safe distance of ancient history. Energy transition in the form of offshore wind farms is big business in New England today. The Block Island wind farm is the first in the US, but it is really only just a pilot for the massive expansion of offshore wind turbines all along the Atlantic seaboard. The draft environmental impact statement for another offshore wind development in the region is a case in point for what that might mean for American coastal Indigenous groups. It references legally mandated ongoing consultations with 6 federally recognized tribes, but restricts the potential impacts of the wind farm on the tribes to only the cultural, historical, and archaeological resources section of the report. In doing so, this process may perpetuate the idea that Indigenous peoples are part of pre- or paleo history and the deep past, with no acknowledgement that the development of industrial-scale offshore wind might affect tribes in other ways. So while some tribes do appear as legally mandated stakeholders in the planning process for offshore wind, tribal agency over energy transition is actually quite limited in practice. Energy transition here is another form of settler supremacy. For our team, this work raises questions about the process of energy transition on the island and in the region. Can energy transitions ever be designed to have anti-colonial potential? What would that look like in this case and for the continued development of offshore wind? Do these concerns require that we shift our scholarly attention away from depoliticized conversations about the social acceptance of new infrastructure among static stakeholder populations? Could recognition justice of the past, present, and future become as important as procedural and distributive justice frameworks, which tend to assume we already know who and what matters? What do we actually want energy transitions to enable? This question seems even more keenly important at this very moment. Earlier this year, I learned that the latest multi-million-dollar offshore wind enterprise in our region has been named Mayflower Wind, explicitly honoring the first European settlers in New England, again without any trace of irony. So one takeaway from this last story could be that there should be more diversity in the offshore wind development industry and conversation, and in climate change adaptation planning in general. I've heard this said, and I don't dispute it, but I want to point out that diversity in this context has come to stand for some vague notion of social difference that colloquially translates to the inclusion of non-white participants in stakeholder groups or decision-making bodies. My experience with the Block Island wind farm and the invisible island of Manasses hints at the fact that this sense of diversity will mean very little without a now familiar generational awareness of historical injustice that must recognize who and what has been erased from the land and seascape, and that must make imaginative room for who and what might yet come to be. For me, the island regions of the Bahamas and the Spermonde and the island of Manasses are not just societal microcosms or living laboratories, although we can see how they can certainly be manipulated by the branding, witnessing, and erasing practices of supremacist industries. But thanks to my own observations and the guidance of others who've helped open my senses, I've begun to think of these islands and many other situations around the world as examples of intersectional ecologies that should push us well beyond the limits of conventional notions of interdisciplinarity and diversity. What does all this mean? My thoughts are still very much in formation, but fortunately, we don't have to think about this on our own. We're guided by many scholars who know that longue durée patterns of injustice, extraction, and exploitation have shaped this world, including our own bodies and the beings, landscapes, and systems we know today. The well-known legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw is one guide on my journey, although she's not commonly cited in relation to climate change. Her term, intersectionality, speaks to the relations of power that undergird the way people, ideas, and things get classified and ordered. She writes about institutionalized social categories like race and gender, and the blindness of governance structures that cannot understand how these categories are inextricably interconnected to disproportionately negate or subjugate whole swaths of human lived experience. Scholars like Crenshaw show me that there is, of course, no such thing as anthropogenic climate change without this messy history of social categorization, hierarchy, and rampant supremacist imperialism. There is no sea level rise, coral degradation, coastal erosion, or mass extinction without this history. And in turn, environmental conservation, sustainable development, renewable energy transition, and ecological restoration seem to all proceed along this same path laid out by supremacy, the path made to reproduce the world in the image of those who seek to exploit it. We can continue down this path, although we already know where it ends. Or we can stop the branding, the market-based solutions, the hierarchical networks, the green-washed rhetorics, and the supremacist master planning, and reorient ourselves towards new ends. We need a massive reframing of the mainstream climate conversation that begins and ends with environmental justice, climate justice, social justice, racial justice, decolonial justice, economic justice, and on simultaneously and perpetually. This involves all of us, and therefore all of you. Toward that end, I want to briefly expose some of you who need it to a few more scholars who can help guide you towards more intersectional work, personally and professionally. These are just a few of the scholars that speak to me. They should speak to you too. Paige West, June Jordan, Justin Hoseby, Banu Subramaniam, Jean O'Brien, Angelique Nixon, Kyle White, Max Liberon. If you're at Columbia, you should of course know the work of your own Paige West, a mentor of mine and model for how to do long-term engaged and socially just work with local communities who are deeply aware of the longue durée. If it were not for her, I would not be speaking to you today about any of this. But of course, some of these scholars are not well known outside of the silos in which their work is slotted. I would not say that they are a diverse group of scholars, although I suppose they are that. I will say that they all act at the intersection of race, gender, nationality, sexuality, and class to make critical connections explicitly visible within supremacist conditions that would otherwise obscure them. They are not necessarily interdisciplinary researchers. They are certainly transdisciplinary, or even better, anti-disciplinary thinkers whose work should help us define climate justice. Here are some examples of their work that has helped to inspire many connections for me and so many others. I'm still in the middle of this reading list that spans decades of material. For example, Some of Us Did Not Die contains essays from the 1970s and 1980s, and Pollution is Colonialism isn't available yet. To my knowledge, it should drop any minute. So pre-order it now. We've always needed exactly this anti-supremacist kind of thinking from scholars who reject universalizing assumptions by showing how our bodies, homes, ecologies, geographies, and our planet are highly contingent formations. We have to heed the arguments of non-binary, transnational, indigenous, Black and brown feminist scholars and their friends if we are ever to approach climate change without reproducing the inequities that brought us to this precipice of multiple compounding crises in the first place. We must all do this reorientation as academics, and we must do this at the centers of our professional lives, not at the margins. Sarah Vaughan, Bridget Garashi, and I have proposed intersectional ecologies as more of an empathetic and ethical position than a theoretical framework. One goal of this work is to bring into focus how ecologies and ecological crises are historical and political projects. And an intersectional approach to ecologies enables us to examine the multiple agencies implicated in their formation. Our basic argument is that since geographies and ecologies are malleable and contingent social facts, it matters who is analyzing their formation, problematization, and the development of proposed solutions. And it matters how those processes are analyzed and witnessed. So a diversity of scholars and disciplines is important, but it cannot be enough by itself if that only means different people starting from the same assumptions and more disciplines asking the same questions with the same blind spots. Instead, diverse perspectives and collaborative research practices work best if they are encouraged to remake science into a tool for justice. So I've presented an autoethnographic path from my oblivious origins through the island-based research and current intersectional scholarship that shapes my work and sense of responsibility amidst the compounding crises of our era. I hope that this talk might inspire you to intentionally define your own positionality and purpose within the climate change conversation. What vital connections can you help make visible within the intersectional ecologies that shape your own life and work? Who are your guides on the path through the mess we find ourselves in? How do you know who and where you are? Thank you very much.
Amelia, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I feel we should all be clapping, but anyway. So yeah, claps, brilliant. That was such an inspiring and I don't know, for me, it was quite a, from my own naive standpoint, a shocking presentation. It really, not in a bad sense, but in a very arresting sense, makes you think, oh my gosh. So I've got a ton of questions I could ask you. I want to make sure I don't monopolize things because I really want to allow time from the audience. But I wanted to go straight to something you said. There are a few things that you said about, there's one phrase you used, and I had to write it down fast: make room for who and what might come to be. And I wanted you to tell me a bit more about what you meant by that. Not in terms of, I can guess what you mean, but it's sort of, it speaks to a certain, almost like a vision of what you think the future might look like in a better world going forward. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you had in mind by that phrase.
Sure. It comes to me from engaging with the work of Miles Lennon, who's an energy scholar, an anthropologist at Brown University, and he talks about in his work the notion of future energy publics. And some of his research is about working with organizers on the ground in California who are working with groups like the Black Lives Matter movement to help people think about their own solar energy practices and kind of decoupling from the state grid and having their own kind of energy independence as a social part of the social justice movement. And so this question of future energy publics, and we could expand this beyond just the realm of energy, for me is really a justice question. Like, and if our research, if our science, if our capacity to think about the publics that we're responsible for and the people who are part of our research, if they can't make room for change and for the creation of collectives and groupings of people who are organizing around things that we can't even imagine, then we're completely in the way. We're completely doing it wrong. So I think part of, for me, why I think Miles' work was so revelatory when I was first reading it, was thinking about we don't have to do social science around energy transition. We don't have to do it in like market research. We're not just studying what the powers that be can already see, the usual suspects of stakeholders. We're not just asking, do you like offshore wind turbines or not? Yes or no, do they look good to you or not? We have to ask bigger and more important questions, like, can industrial scale renewable energy be used as a tool for social justice or not? What kinds of new publics and collectives can it enable, or is it just a tool for disabling those potentialities? And I think we all, even, coastal engineers, ocean engineers need to be able to ask this question. What are they building and for who? And what does it make possible and what does it make impossible? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it raises a lot of important ethical questions around how we treat the environment and for who, you're right. But I mean, it's kind of like, it's a little bit, there's another phrase you used, which actually, no, you didn't quite say this. I said this when I heard what you said. A sort of inextricable link between supremacy, exploitation, and the trashing of the planet, effectively. You didn't say trashing of the planet. But there was this sort of, very powerful link you made between the way that repeatedly racism and supremacy have been tied to exploitation and the way we behave today. So I guess one of the questions I've got is, recognizing that we've got a climate crisis and we're trying to get people to wake up to it. And one of the ways, of course, that we want to do that is to make people aware of the commercial opportunities that there are for doing things differently. And actually, we can actually make you can make a lot of money as an entrepreneur and make a lot of money because that's the way the world works. And we think about that as the thing that could potentially drive both innovation and then solutions to the climate crisis. I mean, Bill Gates' book has just come out and it's kind of like full of the opportunity from technology and entrepreneurship in particular. But it's almost like you're saying, hold on and take another look at this and actually think when you're being an entrepreneur or when you're being a big technology company or when you're putting trillions of dollars of investment into achieving an energy transition, you've got to think about the societies, the communities that are going to be need to be part of this discussion going forward. And I'm wondering whether it almost sounds like, as devil's advocate, that here we are trying to save the planet, and now you're raising a whole load of issues around indigenous communities, etc., and you're getting in the way of us trying to save the planet and stopping us from doing what we need to avoid catastrophic climate change and further destruction of communities. So how would you answer that sort of, the entrepreneur, the person who's trying to get everybody on board with decarbonizing and adapting and doing things differently? How would you answer that and say, in a practical way that might actually allow them to find something that works both for the entrepreneur and recognizes the needs of people in the way that you're describing? Because I found it impossible to imagine how you could ever do it. Well, you can't undo the terrible injustices of the past. But at the same time, we're all struggling to try and go as fast as we can to prevent further damage to the environment going forward.
I think I would, to start, I would say saving the planet for who? I mean, this is a big question that many scholars raise that needs to be asked. Are you saving it for the wealthy and the privileged? And is it going, are the rest of us going to live in, what little bits are left over? Because sometimes that's what it seems like, all of this rush is pointing towards. The very wealthy are going to remain very wealthy. They're going to, be able to enjoy the protected areas and, what bits of, ecology has been conserved for them, and, and they will feel justified because they're paying for it, or they will feel like they're paying for it. And then what's left for everybody else? I think that's a big question that people need to answer. Saving the planet for who? I don't know if that, is going to win me any friends amongst the Bill Gateses of the world.
I mean, only from the point of view that the concern, of course, is that the impacts of climate change are going to be more severe for communities that are underprivileged and actually,
and they already are.
Yeah.
And I think of scholars like Kyle White that I mentioned, and many others who argue that the world, as many of the indigenous peoples and also kind of subsistence communities the world over have have experienced is already over. It's already ended. So it's
Yeah.
not like they're about to experience it. They already have experienced it, and it not just because of climate change, but in the face of kind of rampant colonial extraction from, many different kinds of sources that have, become corporate extraction. So I think, again, that also doesn't necessarily mean, putting it in that way doesn't mean that I'm, going to gain friends amongst a certain sector who really does believe that a certain kind of techno-fix innovation that happens very rapidly is the answer at all costs.
Mm.
Because I don't think those people are capable of construing the costs that are already burdened, that are already borne by people the world over. And so I think, the answer is to pause and to step back and to think, if people have been living in most of the world for many thousands of years in ways that were not transformationally destructive, they might have been transformational, but not in this, not at the scale and extent that they are now. Why are those people not being brought along? Why are they not leading these processes? Why are they completely left out? Why are their visions or their imaginations of the world left out? I think about the offshore energy transition, for example, and in the United States context, and the ways in which Indigenous people are completely sidelined and marginalized from waterways and coastal spaces that they know very well and have known very well. And I think that's just, rushing headlong into that kind of industrial development without the kinds of relationships with people who have known the seascape. Just, it seems, fruitless. It's going to, like I say, and others say, re-territorialize the territory more than it, already has been,
Yeah.
in ways that completely continue to disenfranchise
Yeah.
people.
Pamela's got a hand raised, so I don't know if you wanted to come in here. I've got loads.
Well, yeah.
But go ahead, Pamela.
Yeah, this is really wonderful and fascinating. And thank you, Amelia, for your powerful talk. I wanted to come in here because I wanted to ask about those small nonprofits that were doing coral restoration. Do we have a different model, right, in which that is inclusive? And that's my, the first kind of way that I wanted to get in here. And then the second related question that I had to Alex's first question is, as a historian, I completely believe in the power of the transformational power of writing new narratives. Those can be really powerful drivers of, greater justice, greater inclusion, and especially in terms of, as a historian of science, in terms of the kind of knowledge that's being made and how it's being made, and who should have authority in that knowledge making process. But how do we balance the kind of time pressures of the crisis and the process of writing new narratives, of doing the work of actually having people time to allow those new narratives to be transformational? I mean, how do we balance those? So different models, and how do we balance the time pressures?
Well, so that's something that I'm hoping to get into more on my upcoming sabbatical. The first part of your question, we're going to places, particularly back in the Bahamas, where people are doing much smaller scale coral restoration work in ways that are intentionally designed to make that work a social justice project. But I haven't done that work yet, but it's very much on my radar. And I do think that there is it's going to be a counterpoint kind of story to this large scale kind of multinational corporate sense of urgency, scaling up massive effort to salvage something in the face of change. And then, there's, small communities of people with, PVC pipe and toothbrushes. So I think it's going to be an interesting juxtaposition. I don't know yet what will come of that. I do think, I don't think that people are stopping doing the work of responding to climate change. I don't think people are stopping the work of adaptation. I think, people, like I said, have been adapting and are continually adapting all the time. I think the question that should always be at the front of our mind when we're thinking about how we narrativize this is, we make those equity issues, extremely visible. How do you make those the first question, not the last question? How do you make sure that, the people who need to be incorporated and lead the work are actually leading it? Most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're not even included. And I think that's just, I don't know if this is answering the second part of your question at all, but I think that is something we're all responsible for, no matter whether we're social scientists or natural scientists, oceanographers, engineers, that question of who is leading these efforts, and whose narratives are we listening to? That should always be something that we ask ourselves. And if we're not sure, we need to, examine that, because the narratives are being told, the stories are unfolding as we speak.
So can I just dive in there? Because are you saying that, okay, so let's try and do something about this. Okay, let's reimagine the world. Let's even imagine we might want to build a climate school or some crazy idea like that. And if you were to build a climate school, how would you do things differently? Or how would you engage with people differently in terms of providing advice to the world or learning from the world about how one could do things better in terms of the climate, adjusting or adapting to or mitigating the climate crisis? Can you tell me exactly what we should, if these people are not leading, for example, does that mean we actually need to be doing all we can to provide open and free education to communities where they need to actually understand more about climate change and decarbonization, and working with them on those solutions and providing education? Or is it something where you feel that actually what we need to be doing is just basically engaging more and learning from, this is something that I guess I didn't get until a couple of years ago when we started talking about the climate school, that actually, academics have got a lot to learn from communities. And actually, it's not about us, providing solutions. It's about us learning from people who actually have some of the solutions, or actually have been at least understanding what's happening to their own environment in a way that we don't necessarily connect with. So I do feel there's a whole lot there, but I still don't quite have in my head how we go from where we are today to your vision of anti-colonial decarbonization, which is another great term you use, anti-colonial decarbonization. So is there something I'm missing about what we really need to be doing right now and what we should focus on, particularly with the chance to build a climate school?
Well, I can't give you, the silver bullet answer for how to build a climate school, but I do think this notion that you're going to have a kind of this global conversation and you're going to, speak at this massively abstract scale is part of the issue. I think part of it is, how are you actually building meaningful, long-term, sustained relationships with specific people in specific places, not just helicoptering in, not just stopping to build capacity, doing rapid assessments, not just doing outreach, or even, when you say engagement, that how are you actually living lives with the people in the front lines of climate change? Like, how are you actually sharing existence with those people? And I would argue that probably most of us are not. Mm-hmm. We don't have any ties to those places. We live in our probably usually most urban metropoles, and we live in this very colonized way where if we do have engagement with people, it's on our terms, our meetings, our schedules, our multilateral sessions at XYZ fora, and we're not actually living real life with real people. And until that changes, what are you going to do?
Yeah, good question. Okay,
So there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, could I just, there's a question in the chat that relates to this. What role do you think education plays in this process? Is it educating Bahamians and local Indonesians to be agents of their own future? We're speaking at an educational institution. And I mean, I want to answer this by saying co-production of knowledge. Co-production of knowledge is so important. But what would you say, Amelia? I mean, it speaks to this question of how do we live life? How do we educate with people instead of talking at people?
I mean, I think that, again, yeah, that is the same answer I think applies. I think we really have to get rid, and many people have said this for a very long time, but we really have to get rid of this sense that that we are different kinds of people, that scientists are different kinds of people, and that we have different kinds of knowledge, and that we have something to give and nothing, or that we're somehow that there's an us and them. I think, until, and this means transgressing all of the the boundaries of race and class and nationality, things that are actually very hard to do. It's very much, it's easier to say it than to actually do it. And it doesn't mean, people don't necessarily want you to try and transgress their boundaries. So that's a whole other discussion too. But I mean, it is a complete rethinking and reimagination of what relationships are and what they could be. And so, having a climate school at an Ivy League institution is fantastic, but what are the inherent limits already built into that model? Identify those, and then think about, what parts of those are actually necessary, or are any of those limits actually necessary for the work that you want to do or that we want done?
Could I call on people who have their...
Yeah, some hands.
Yeah, there's some hands up. Sarah Cole is first, Dean of Humanities at Columbia.
Thank you. Thank you, Amelia, for coming and speaking to us. And as Alex said, I think this was a serious and sobering and important talk, and I'm really interested to think with you. I have a lot of thoughts, but I think I'll just ask a question that's of a different sort, really. It picks up on some of the things that Pamela was asking, and it's really about temporality and the imagination. I was very struck in your talk by many things, including your thinking about the, as you called it, invisible island of Manassas, and your whole account of that project of, for yourself, finding this community and this history and its value and importance for you in thinking about the whole area was really striking. And Pamela, as a historian, was talking about the importance of the transformational potential of narrative. And at the same time, you mentioned in an answer to, I think, Alex, this phrase that you shared from another critic of future energy publics. And I just wondered how you think, this is something I think about a lot, and I've been having a variety of conversations with people about how we think about the future, the near future, the far future. And, how do we think about the future in a way that is deeply connected with the past and informed by it? And, when you do your research and you think about how before you begin anything, you want to understand the space you're in from a historical point of view and from an informed and thoughtful historical point of view. So in a way, it's a more abstract or intellectual question about how you approach time. And a lot of the questions have been about time. There's an urgency. We need to do this now. How do we balance these different time scales? So it's also just about your own thinking in these scales. And the Anthropocene, of course, is a time question as well. But I'm just curious to hear you think about a little bit more about some of those things that seem to me to be really interesting and to be about issues too around writing and the imagination, about expression and thought, in ways that many, many different kinds of people might come to these questions.
Well, I mean, let's see, how do I want to tackle that? I like thinking, the only way we all think is thinking together with other people and other ideas. And I'm trying very hard to make that explicit in my own work. So thinking about, Kyle White's arguments about indigenizing futures and this notion of, back to the future, that, indigenous peoples, particularly in the Americas, but not exclusively, have already, lived through the apocalypse. Thinking about how that might be also true of formerly enslaved peoples, indigenous and African in the American context as well. Thinking with scholars who are trying to reimagine connections between the past and the present, making those connections visible, doing a lot of this recognition work, and then thinking about what that recognition of the past means for what's possible in the future, and how there's these constant connections between the past and the present, and how, so I'm thinking, people who are being particularly historical in their discussions of the past, and then being particularly speculative, this notion of speculative fictions, science fiction, speculative fiction, and their arguments about the future, their conceptualizations of the future. In my science studies class, I teach with Ruha Benjamin. I don't know if you are familiar with her work, but she has a piece called Racial Fictions, Biological Facts. It's an article, and in it she has a short story called Ferguson is the Future. And I like to teach this to my students, who are 20 and who don't know who Michael Brown was, and they don't know Ferguson, Missouri, but they have lived through 2020 and they do know who George Floyd is. So, it's a highly resonant work that imagines, 2064 as a time when the police have been disbanded, defunded, to use, current language, and there have, been instead the Reparations Act that has brought victims of police violence back to life or regenerated parts of their bodies. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, you have to read it. Ferguson is the Future. It's a really intense piece of fiction, thinking about what connects the past and the present, and what that opens or closes for the future, and what, basically what will happen to us if we don't get rid of our racial categories and our, the racial categories that order our lives, and the relationships between capital and race, supremacy, basically, that are kind of the air that we breathe in our society. And it's a cautionary tale. So, there's just, for me, there's just such possibility for kind of figuring out what we need to avoid, and thinking about what we want to celebrate, what we want to create. And I don't think, most of us in the sciences don't necessarily get to spend time in this kind of imaginative, creative realm. We don't read Afrofuturism. We don't read this kind of material, and we should. Because I think, we're kind of creatively stunted, and that lack of imaginative capacity really affects the choices that we make in our own research.
I was really
There's so much that you could say, and I'm not sure if I'm being articulate at all. I was addressing that in some way.
Thank you very much. I was really struck with what you said during your talk about the focus, the lens with which we look at problems. If we change the lens, there's a very different story that you can tell. And I think that, creative possibilities, literature, which Sarah is a professor of English literature, literature is one of those areas that we can really change the lens in really significant ways. I'm going to call on Julia Shaw, who's had her hand up now for a very long time.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, sorry, other notifications going off. Yeah, so I was very personally moved by your talk today, and I'm really grateful for the amount of vulnerability as well as rigor to your own work that you brought. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I was born and raised in Seattle, where I am right now. And so I related a lot to the need to evolve past what I think you coined the term white supremacist myopia of
Sure, I
Seattle.
didn't coin that term.
Okay. Well, it was the first time I heard it, and it really struck a chord with me. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you contend with the violence of this myopia, and sort of not just within the city where you and I are from, but also within the field of science itself. And if you think this is an opportunity for innovation, I know a lot of people become very jaded or disillusioned with any institutions once they realize the implicit biases that they carry.
Well, I mean, it's very much always a work in progress. And I think since, coming to University of Rhode Island and actually being, supported by an institution to certain degrees, and, spending time in one place as opposed to constantly moving around, as we do as academics often, it's given me the time and space and breathing room to actually begin to understand all of the many multi-layered violences, the violences of colonization in New England, and that deep history, and the violences of kind of indigenous populations who are very much still here, very much struggling for recognition, the violences of kind of the erasures of those populations, the erasures of the African-American populations, the erasures of the many waves of certain kinds of immigrant populations, which populations count and which don't. And then of course you add, the university's structure on top of that, and its hierarchy, and the fact that universities are supremacist institutions and have always been and are designed to be. And then, to be a scholar who I think I'm very much in a process of awakening, there's scholars who've known this from jump. I am not one of those scholars. I definitely have learned to see the world differently, to learn to see my place in it differently, to learn to see my choice to be an academic differently, to think about these hierarchies and categories that we're all kind of fit into, and kind of, I think it's left me just at a place where I realize I need to find my kin, to find my networks, to find the people whose thoughts, who are already doing the work that can dismantle a lot of this. And I'm very much in the process of finding that, putting scholars in conversation, at least in my own head, through my own practices of reading, trying to host conversations at my own institution, or participating in conversations at yours, where we raise some of these questions. And I think it's a beginning. It's a beginning that we need to have outside of Native American and Indigenous Studies departments, outside of Africana Studies departments, outside of Gender and Women's Studies departments. We need to absolutely collaborate with the scholars in those fields. They already know all of this. They have known it for a very long time, and it is the scientific community that is way, 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 way late to the table. And there's just no limit to what can be done once we start building these, I think, much more profoundly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, like I like to say, anti-disciplinary conversations. So, the time to start reaching out across those disciplinary silos is now. I don't know if that helps.
Thanks. I'm going to call on Saul B., who has also had their hand up for a long time.
Hi, thank you. So along that note, and going back to kind of the contradictory nature of a New England Ivy League university being the forefront of climate education. I think with the current context of the Columbia graduate workers on strike, and the developments in the Stephen Donziger case with Chevron and the indigenous populations of Ecuador, hold on, let me back up for a second. I've been studying the Red Deal. If anyone's not familiar with the Red Deal, it's a publication by the Red Nation as sort of a response and extension of the Green New Deal. So as students, many of whom come from worlds of privilege, what role can we take in, I'm not sure if forcing the university's hand is the right verbiage, but I guess holding accountable, changing structures, and really like crafting new paths for the future and for roles of universities. Because I mean, obviously, I don't think decolonizing a university is not going to be a thing that can happen overnight, if it can happen at all, due to the nature of institutions. But, you know, with everything that you're saying about bringing in the people who have been doing the work, bringing in the people who have been living in symbiosis with the ecosystems without messing it up the way industry has, and with all of that. And we see what happens when someone of privilege goes out on a limb for these indigenous cultures and gets sued by Chevron and put under house arrest for 2 years because it's one single person trying to do it. Yeah, that's a lot of things, not in a very cohesive question, but yeah, I guess using what we have and using what platform we have as students at an Ivy League to shift the trajectory and the role of a university to accomplish the things that need to be accomplished.
I mean, yes, do it. I mean, a lot of the time students really are the drivers of a lot of change at an institution, and or at least the drivers of change when it comes to faculty scholarship. If maybe not, you know, necessarily at the administrative level, but, you know, you work closely with faculty. So, you know, tell them what you want to learn, you know, tell them what classes you want, you know, and think about how you take that out into the world. You know, how can you organize? How are you already organizing in ways that are, you know, potentially profoundly transformative? You know, you have a voice, and use it. That I think that's, you know, that's something that we all need to remember. And faculty too, junior faculty too, we have a voice. I just got tenure, but I still very much feel like a junior person. You know, we need to use our voice to change structures in the institution to the extent that we can. And when we run up against obstacles, identify them and figure, you know, and plan for dismantling them.
I wonder, Alex, if I can turn the question around to you, you know, hearing all of this, and you know, you asked Amelia, well, how should we, in effect, how should we organize the climate school at this institution? So what would you say to, you know, that question about, you know, the role of the university in social change and in, you know, turning climate science into something that is striving to be, to really take into account society, to take into account social change and equity and justice? I know it's obviously a huge question and it's putting you on the spot, but.
No, I'm delighted by it. It's great. It's just, I mean, basically, it's pretty clear it's become very clear why you need a university. Doesn't have to be Columbia, but you need a university with immense academic breadth, and a university where students actually like to protest. I think that's a really important thing. I was gonna, when I went to Oxford, I couldn't understand Oxford, and well, for many people they still can't. But somebody sent me this book. It was written by I can't remember the guy's name now. Carl Zimmer, that's right, New York Times writer, called Soul Made Flesh. It was about how Oxford got really set on fire in the 1600s with the discovery of a few scientists getting together and talking about what it was that was really working in the world. And this was people like the guy who figured out the brain and figured out that's where you do your thinking. There were people who figured out all kinds of stuff in the natural world. This was the founding of the Royal Society eventually. And it was 400 years ago. And of course, it was brilliant. It revolutionized the world. These guys went on and actually rebuilt London after the Great Fire. And so I was thinking, well, what's the Columbia equivalent of this? If somebody gives me a book about Columbia, and then I started reading about what was happening in the 60s with the Beat Generation in New York City, and some of these great thinkers coming up with the counterculture movement that actually became very big, of course, in America. It wasn't just here, of course. But you realize that there was a culture of just discussing and arguing and debating, and to some extent revolution and protest that was actually really, really important, not just for changing Columbia, but making a statement about how we need to be doing things differently in society. And to some extent, I think that's tremendous. That may not be the kind of thing you might not think Jack Kerouac is the greatest symbol of Columbia University, but I think actually what that culture did was really important in terms of getting people to feel empowered about changing the future. And you kind of need to have that around the climate crisis. You need an environment in which people say, this has to be about people and we have to think differently about our future. And I was really struck by this idea of imagining a future world through a different lens and through the lens of Indigenous people or and other populations who've suffered terribly over the last 50 years. And in the process, or hundreds of years, and in the process, we built places like Columbia University or other institutions all doing climate change without stopping and thinking about how we might envisage it differently going forward. So I think this is a big opportunity for the climate school. We're starting from scratch. Of course, we're starting with a lot of academics who already care about the climate crisis, but we could do it differently. And we could think differently about the school in terms of ways to think about the energy problem, ways to think about, communities and what our solutions are going to be in terms of disaster resilience, etc., in a way that really does engage with communities that are going to be underrepresented typically in our universities. And we need to actually think about this as not being about the white males that dominate so much of society and university, but actually about all people going forward. So I think there's, I actually talked to Kyle White a couple of years ago, Page West suggested I have a chat with him, and he was great, and we've found some wonderful other people to talk to as well. And I think we need to figure out how to build that in to all our curricular offerings and all our research programs and everything that we're thinking about in terms of how we're going to be providing policy advice, etc., going forward. We've got a brilliant opportunity to do a lot, but we could do it differently as well. And so I think we should think about how we can make that a very effective part of the climate school. And the reason why I'm saying this, I'm really impressed by what Amelia said, but at the same time, there's a lot of people here at Columbia who've been saying something similar, that we need to be thinking differently. So so this is very, very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. And I'm afraid we're going to have to close it there. I really want to deeply thank Amelia. Thank you so much for your powerful talk. Thank you, Alex, for your wonderful, thoughtful questions, your desire to engage and to think about the future of the climate school in this way. And I want to thank our audience members who have just been terrifically thoughtful and very active in the chat. So thank you all very much for attending, and please do tune in on May 18th at the same time, 5:30 to 7, for the second in our series, Rosalind Lapierre, who will be speaking about climate and society and environmental justice. So I hope to see you all next time, and I just want to say thank you so much, Amelia. Thank you, Alex. It's been really terrific.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.